Welcome everybody, welcome. Lovely to see all your faces coming up on the screen. Very exciting to see everybody. We'll just get everybody together first of all, and then we'll get going.
So you should put the song for us, Chris. I don't know that song, You Have a Friend.
Ah, yes, that's right. I could sing it to you. No.
Why not? You should.
Yeah, we have to work out how to do that. It's sort of one thing at a time at the moment, Adriana.
And, I can support Chris if needed.
I'll send you a link to it, Adriana, after the webinar.
Oh yeah, that'd be easy. Actually, Mel and Adriana have said, they're my co-founders, they have said that if I sing, that's it, they're out.
Yeah, we're going to resign if you start singing. Right, shall I start? I feel as though we are probably all gathered.
Please do.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Very, very warm welcome to everyone to this webinar. One of the reasons that, oh no, I'll do the housekeeping bits first. If you could all keep your speakers on mute during the session, and also if you could put all your questions on chat, and Chris and I will be fielding them and come to you as appropriate after the speakers have finished. One of the reasons that Mel, Chris and I founded the Elders Council was to bring the scary word of succession out into the light, because it's so rarely discussed, and to make sure that people in our community have access to the accumulated wisdom of the social entrepreneurs, and to feel that there is support and to give support to each other within the community. So this is a platform for all of us. And our colleague Caitlin, who many of you seem to be named Caitlin today, is her attempt at world domination. She'll put her contact details in the chat if you'd like to send any questions or contributions or suggestions to make sure that we make this useful to everyone. Building an organization that addresses the challenges that the world and humankind finds is very hard, and the journey's tough. And then as we approach the point of succession, whether we are moving up, sideways, or out of our organization, here are another set of challenges. And we know that this is very, very difficult. Founders often feel alone and even shamed by the experience of succession, asking of themselves, who am I if I'm not my organization? How will I manage psychologically, emotionally, or financially? Will the organization continue to have the impact that I envision? We've heard in previous webinars from social entrepreneurs themselves, and today we're privileged to have 3 speakers who've seen succession in the social enterprise community from different perspectives. Each comes from an organization that have supported so many of us on our journeys. So I'm going to hand you over to Chris, who's going to introduce the speakers to you. So have a great ride.
Thank you, Andrea, very much indeed. Colleagues, please note that we are recording this session. If there's any problems with that, please turn off your video. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Francois. He, of course, as you know, is the executive director of the Schwab Foundation. He has an extraordinary background in social entrepreneurship, which we have written up on the website, and we are delighted to be able to welcome him. Francois, do please come in.
Thank you so much, Chris. And first of all, just to say hello to all the very friendly faces and people that I know, and for those I don't, just delighted to be here. A big thank you to this Elders Council for inviting me. I, just a few weeks ago, was literally sitting at their feet. They were, all three of them, on a sofa, and I was sitting on the floor with my shoes off, feeling like that was a really special moment. So I want to just pay tribute to, I think, the pioneers of this entire field. You know, I certainly feel, you know, for the Schwab Foundation that I worked at 15 years ago and then returned 2 or so years ago, this field only exists because of you, right? You know, we as a foundation only exist because of you. So in a way, being here is just really a privilege, and so a tribute. So the little I can do to support, I think, many discussions that have been coming for some time, and the emphasis you're putting it on here is a small way of saying thank you. So perhaps I'll start with some reflections that, from the Schwab Foundation's point of view, because I worked here 15 years ago or so and then returned, I know that these discussions are not necessarily new, that they have been in the minds of social entrepreneurs for quite some time. And I think they'll probably go through cycles of thinking about this at the various stages of being a founder or a leader. I know that together with the wonderful and late Pamela Hartigan, we had encouraged these discussions 15 years ago, because the Schwab Foundation in a way was, through its selection process, looking at quite well accomplished, established social entrepreneurs who were already running for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Those questions were already present. And I think, you know, Pamela did a lot to create space for it. I did one of, at least I think, certainly within the Schwab Foundation's community, the first survey of what is now called well-being. I guess we were looking at burnout at the time. And as a medical doctor at the time, I was particularly interested in, you know, what was just visible. And even with that survey, so I think this must have been 2006 at the time, you know, high rates of the symptoms of burnout, of divorces, of relationship strains, of substances. Those were just realities, I think, of the pressures of this space. And so there were, you know, there was those kinds of pressures, but there were also questions around when is the right time to think about succession. And interestingly, we had a small little celebration, 20-year reunion of the first inaugural employees of the Schwab Foundation, and also just showed, you know, people have taken different paths. Some have stayed very committed to the single organization they have built and have stayed the course. Others have gone on to be serial entrepreneurs. Others have gone on to do a range of other things. And so what's been of particular interest to me as I've come back into this role is to think about, what do we do with all this experience and wisdom, and what are the choices available to social entrepreneurs? So I have come into this role also thinking about how do we create a community. And at the time, actually, I was, as I took on this role, was given a direction to almost grandfather, if I can use that word, to create an alumni community of the Schwab Foundation awardees that were no longer, you know, active or more recently awarded. And I resisted and actually went against the direction that I was given, because I felt that the experience of the leaders and the founders who may have gone on to do other things was actually very much needed in not only the support of others, but also in thinking about what we are trying to think about together as women right now, is how do we create more systemic change. And so I'm really interested in experienced social entrepreneurs and the opportunities they have to be system leaders. And I'll give you 1 or 2 examples of where I've seen that happen, where a particular founder has built an organization, a very successful organization, but it was built to do a particular thing or one particular aspect of the sector, or fix a particular issue within a more complex problem. And as one of the reasons for them thinking about leaving was recognizing the constraints that organization held for them. So I don't want to give particular names, etc., but I want to try and paint a scenario that I think that others have. So some of the reason for thinking about moving on, and part of the reason for succession might be organizational, but it might also be that the vision of what comes with experience is constrained by the organization that's there. Not to say that an organization shouldn't exist or that there shouldn't be another leader or that work shouldn't happen, but that the experience that's been gained allows you to see perhaps that problem in a different way, the opportunities in a different way, and recognize that's there for a reason, let it play its role. Maybe in order to take up another kind of role, I need to create another organization or be involved in another part of the field. And so I've been really interested in looking at how quite successful social entrepreneurs have gone to work in government. Some really interesting examples of how, one example from my own country, Taffy Adler, who built the Johannesburg Housing Company, ended up being the CEO of a whole new state agency called the Housing Development Agency, which was basically reporting to the Minister of Housing. Because of this amazing model, which was kind of acclaimed by the UN Habitat, etc., of creating social housing that was both very effective and but also quite sustainable in terms of the business model. So there've been really interesting ways in which social entrepreneurs have gone on to do other things and have been what I'm interested in, which is kind of system leaders. Again, we've seen those that have actually gone into private sector and thought about, well, how do they take kind of the work that they've done and try to leverage a larger market through what's happening in private sector. So I think I'm not going to go too long because there'd be so many experiences in the room, but I wanted to give a couple of reasons why I think it's an interesting topic, why I think we need to think not only beyond, well, it's the end of the journey, that there's you're holding an organization back. There are all kinds of other reasons why a founder might feel a need for succession. They may feel, but there might also be opportunity. So I want to look also at the positives of why succession might happen and why, of course, that's healthy for the organization, but potentially healthy for the individual, but also perhaps healthy for the sector. And there might be really interesting opportunities for them in the future.
Francois, you have about 3 minutes left. Perfect.
So one thing I wanted to do, two last things I wanted to do was one to talk about, there was a really good article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which I can share on link once I'm finished talking, around the different roles founders can play. And I found this particularly useful in my own transition. So I had set up not a separate organization, but a center at a university called the Bertha Center for Social Innovation, which felt like a bit of a kind of social, entrepreneurial effort within a university, and that grew. But I found that article extremely helpful because it spoke about what founders, the different role founders can play. I won't go into too much detail on it, but what's really useful about that article is it opens up options. And I think it opens up options about talking about that together with the new successor, together with the board, around the different kinds of constructs that can be created, but also to leave the door open for revisiting whatever decisions are made initially in an interim period until it feels that there's time to leave completely, time to stay on in certain kinds of capacities. And I think there's some really interesting evidence around how that impacts the current organization. The last thing I wanted to speak about was my own personal experience is also about thinking about leadership transition in the context of ceding power. Ceding power is important in a range of different scenarios. And in my particular scenario, it was also in the context of racial transformation in South Africa. And thinking about the journey and how to balance both what is organizational needs, what are personal needs, what are kind of needs for the country and the context in particular, and working with the board and with the team to go through those processes. It was a really difficult process to go through for many reasons. It was one that I had proactively sought with the board, and yet still, is fraught with challenges that one feels like, what do I need to take responsibility for? What are issues of legacy and history in a country, and what is right for the institution and for the center? So in that context, I think it was, I can only offer that it is a very complex process thinking about succession. There are all these dimensions. I think it's very healthy in many ways. I think it opens up opportunities for much richness for both the individual and for the organization. And all I can say is that around my last 6 months at the Bertha Center were actually some of my most enjoyable when we had made this decision about the transition, recognizing what I could do, what I could give, and that it created a space for ongoing support for the next generation that would take that forward. I'm going to leave it at that because I've touched on so many different issues in a short time, but really looking forward to the rest of the panelists and the discussion.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much, Francois. That's perfect timing. So that's really great. I can remember that feeling of lightness when transitioning from, out of one organization and having already given the resignation and all of that. Absolutely. So now, and thank you once again, Francois. We now turn to Adriana Crăciun, who is the senior advisor to the Oak Foundation in the field of organizational development and capacity building. And we very much look forward to hearing from you, Adriana. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for this kind invitation. I will talk about how Oak supports social entrepreneurs and leaders in the process of succession and transition. I am very happy that I have the opportunity to listen to such, wise speakers and learn from you. It is a subject which preoccupies us a lot at Oak. We fund a lot of nonprofits around the world in 40 different countries, and we see this very often in our work, mostly as a challenge. And my own personal experience, let's say, of witnessing a leadership transition as an adult was back home in Romania with the Romanian Revolution and the transition of the dictator Ceausescu. So that was not a very positive one. So I'm really committed to supporting only positive and healthy leadership transitions. A few words about Oak, just to let you know, give you a little bit of context. We are a 30-year-old family-led foundation. So the work of the foundation basically reflects the vision and the values of its founders. We disperse around $300 million per year in nonprofits, in grants to nonprofits in over 40 different countries. We have 6 main thematic programs: human rights issues affecting women, prevention of child sexual abuse, environment, learning differences, and housing and homelessness. We employ a rights-based approach in our grant making, which means that through our funding, we aim to empower individuals, communities, and institutions to promote the protection and the enjoyment of their rights. And we have a special focus at the request of our trustees on marginalized and disadvantaged population. We also pursue gender equality and partnership with the organizations we fund. Besides the funding commitment that we are making to our partners, we also have a commitment to support additional capacity strengthening support, what we call support beyond grant making. And as we are not an operational foundation, we do not provide the support ourselves, but we rather support organizations to have access to quality consultants, to have access to quality mentors, trainers, courses, resources, whatever they need. We did define a few principles which are important for us in our work, in this capacity strengthening work. We want to build ownership of the change process with a partner and to ensure that they receive the quality facilitation and consulting support. I'm getting some noises. Is the sound okay? Do you mind muting yourselves? The practical reality, though, is very challenging, even if we want to respect these principles all the time, because we as donors can only influence how these principles align in a given case to a point. We cannot really control them because, for example, Oak has this funding power we are talking about all the time, which means that we can only speak through a megaphone. the more we push for capacity building, the more it may undermine partner ownership, which we feel is at the core of what we do. And we may be able to help partners identify and access quality capacity building providers, but the final choice has to remain in our partners' hands, even if that means sometimes that they may opt for something which we don't consider the best quality or optimal for them. So it is not always easy to be helpful without being intrusive in our position. So I just wanted to set this in before I continue to the topic of our conversation is how do we support actually leaders in the process of transition? For us, leadership has always been a very important topic. We survey our grantees all the time, and we know that next to fundraising and communication, leadership is always part of the top 3 needs that they are giving us when they give indications on what we can support. On the one hand, we hear from executive directors and CEOs, like Andrea was saying earlier, who tell us that they feel isolated, unsupported, and unappreciated by their boards, by their funders, and sometimes by their own constituencies. So obviously, like all of you, we have seen a lot of stress and burnout, especially in the past 2 years, and especially among the human rights defenders, who are one of the most important constituencies of our funding. On the other hand, we support many small to medium-sized organizations where leaders usually set the predominant culture and style of the way of working. And you probably know of Lalou, what he said in his Reinventing Organizations a few years back. Consciously or unconsciously, leaders put in place organizational structures, practices, and cultures that make sense to them, that correspond to their way of dealing with the world. So consequently, the impact of leader and any transition process associated, positive or negative, has very profound impact, especially when there is change. So this is the case. This is where we sit as donors. We have to, deal with this type of context. So what do we do in practice? In most cases, we will provide funds and advice. We do it for the departing leader to hire coaching, mentoring support. In a couple of cases, we actually had to provide financial support to strengthen pension plans because these people were feeling that they had an economical problem. They couldn't live because of economical reasons. We provide funds for coaching and mentoring for new leaders, or for them to attend courses in leadership or to build management skills. A few years ago, we did a very interesting project, which we just evaluated in the summer. We set up a peer consultation group of CEOs from different sectors. We didn't want to put people together who found themselves in a competitive, they come from the same sector, so they compete for the same funds. And this provided a safe space for them to build trusting personal relationship and help them work through complex challenges. We employed a facilitator and used a certain technique, the Nancy Klein thinking environment. And we hoped that once that social capital is built through these facilitated meetings, they can continue to support each other beyond our project. We support strengthening second-tier leadership, not that much, not as much as we would like to, but we want to be more intentional in the future. We think that this is extremely important in order to have a good management team who can support the departing and the incoming leader. But also we look at strengthening the organization in general. And like I said earlier, from that quote from Lalou, new leaders want to bring their own imprint, and they come with a new strategic direction, obviously, a restructuring, and definitely if none of these, they will bring a new culture. So we want to make sure that we look after the staff of the organization as well.
And now about 3 minutes to go.
Perfect. And sometimes we do nothing, right? So in the beginning of the funding relationship, we don't have the enough trust, the trusting relationship which we feel that is essential in this kind of support. We will have an initial due diligence dialogue with the organization. We will look at the governance of the organization, not so much at the leadership quality. We will make a note if we see that the president or the ED is there for 20, 30 years. So we have that, but we will open the conversation later on. We definitely want to wait for the right moment to have that trust built before we would propose any measure. So what are some of the challenges we face in this support? We basically is the question all the time, what am I going to do next? Where am I going if I transition out of the organization? And this is a case in point from our work in Ethiopia. I'll have 2 minutes on this, Chris, I promise, but be ruthless, cut me out if I'm going too far. We support a number of organizations in the country which are working in the field of prevention of child sexual abuse since 2003. And 2 years ago, having had ourselves a leadership transition internally, the new director came with a new strategy for the program. So we were faced with a necessity to exit from some of the funding relationships we had. So we provided funding for 4 years, but we also added on top of that capacity strengthening support. We knew that the funding will be welcomed, but we were not sure about the capacity building because our local staff made us aware that some of the organizations were led by the same person for the last 20, 30 years, oftentimes the founder of the organization, and that they were not always open to change. So we started to look at what we can do to support these leaders to move on. And as we learned that they wanted to go, but there was no place for them beyond the organization that they were leading. So unfortunately, I do a mea culpa, we had not paid enough attention to this issue so far. And too late, we realized that this was, as the study which I know Chris has shared with you, this was a burning issue for the sector, a chronic problem of CEOs who were there for 30 or 40 years. So it became particularly important for us to understand and learn how we can be better in the future and how we can help the sector in general to understand this issue better. So we looked at a number of factors. We learned that the context, a culture in which rewards positional power rather than your expertise and your wisdom, which you have gained for so many years, and a subsistence mentality of the nonprofit sector is inhibiting healthy leadership transitions. Of course, the political context in which all these NGOs are working under a very restrictive legislation doesn't help either. Another factor is the individual themselves who fear losing position, status, livelihood, who can't let go of power, especially among funder leaders who see the organization as their own child, and staffing constraints because we don't, as donors, don't pay necessarily for second-tier leadership, and also boards who do not put leadership succession on their agenda, either because they are—
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm just about to get ruthless.
Please, absolutely. I'll be happy to continue during the question and answer.
No problem, no problem. And thank you so much. And we have just distributed the link that you mentioned through the chat. So that should be fine. Thank you very much indeed. I would strongly recommend that people have a look at the documents that have been distributed in the chat that Adriana has mentioned. They're fascinating. And thank you so much, Adriana, for your transparency. That's really very helpful indeed to the conversation. So now we turn to our last speaker, Tim Hanstad. He is, of course, the CEO of the Chandler Foundation and was, prior to that, he was in the field of social entrepreneurship as the CEO and co-founder of Landesa, a well-known organization. And so, Tim, we would love you to give us some reflections and some thought from your side. Tim, welcome, and thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful to be here today with so many friends, old friends and new friends. Pardon me. I want to start by, first of all, thanking Chris, you and Andrea and Mel for starting and leading this Elders Council. Thank you. It's such important and needed work. Also want to thank my co-speakers here, Francois and Adriana. I actually have, I and my former organization, Landesa, have been beneficiaries of the good work of the Schwab Foundation, the Oak Foundation. So thank you not only for your comments today, but for the good work that you do in the sector, which I've been privileged to see up close. As Chris mentioned, I'm the CEO of the Chandler Foundation. I won't spend time talking about the Chandler Foundation, but do visit our website, because I'm not going to speak today primarily from my role as a donor. Happy to get into that in questions. I'm going to speak primarily of my past role as the founder or co-founder of an organization, and as one who not only was on two sides of a transition. That is, I took over the reins of leadership from my co-founder, and then I passed it on to someone else. So I want to speak to that. But let me start with two quick observations about this important topic. I'll tell a little bit about my story. I'm going to finish with like 7 quick lessons from my experience, and hopefully I can get this all in 10 minutes. And if I don't, Chris will cut me off. First, observations. First of all, leadership transitions will happen. It's not an if, it's like death. It's not an if, it's a when. And like death, the more we plan for it, the better off it's going to happen. So I feel like sometimes leaders, and particularly founders, can almost be in denial about that it will happen, it will happen. The second is that those transitions, and particularly when they involve a founder or a longtime CEO, are events that are high risk for the organization. They are laden with enormous risk, but also with significant opportunity. So planning for them and doing them well is extremely important, not only for the founder who's leaving, not only for the successor, not only for the entire organization, but maybe most importantly for those that the organization serves. Because if it's been touched upon earlier, but unfortunately the experience of founder CEO transitions in our space has been filled with many challenging, painful experiences for the founders, for successors, for the organization, and for those the organization serves. So transitions are inevitable, and they are times of extreme importance for the organization. So very quickly, my story. So I co-founded Landesa in 1992 with my former law school professor and mentor, Roy Prosterman. He was 30 years my senior. When we started out, it was just the two of us. He clearly was the leader of the organization and played that role in the early years. Several years in, Roy was approaching 70, and after we had offices in a few countries, a staff of about 25 people, Roy and the board decided to hand off leadership to me. And Roy importantly recognized the importance of giving me space, not closely watching over my shoulder. So he very purposely stepped off the executive leadership team. He went onto the board. He never offered me advice unless I asked for it. I asked for it often, and he gave it, often reluctantly, because he was so conscious about giving me space. Roy's elegance and grace in transitioning out of leadership and handing off the reins to me was a really important lesson and an incredible gift to me as a leader. And he continued working with Landesa as a senior advisor and leading a lead program person for some of Landesa's most important programs. So one of the learnings from that was that I wanted to give that same gift to my successor. So fast forward many years later, Landesa now is larger. It's done work in dozens of countries. We've worked with governments to play key roles on land rights reforms that have provided secure legal rights to more than 150 million households. We had more than a dozen offices around the world. Things were going well, but for a number of reasons, I thought it was time for me to step out of the CEO role and hand the reins of leadership to a new leader to take Landesa into its next season. So after careful discussions with my wife, with Roy, with a couple of mentors, I told the board chair I wanted to work with the board to find my successor, transition out of the CEO role, and do it within 6 months if possible. And I told the board that I'd be willing to stay on as staff after my successor was hired if two conditions were met. One was that if my successor wanted me to stay on, and two, if I was going to report to my successor. By the way, the board chair initially, who was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, said that that'll never work because we won't be able to find someone to be your successor if you're still around. No one will want to do that. Actually, it went a different way, and I can tell more of that story later if there are questions about it. But so fortunately, the board and I found a successor, Chris Jochnick, who wanted me around, and I did report to him after he was hired as a CEO. I did report to my successor for 2+ years after that, taking the title of co-founder and senior advisor. I moved out of the United States, where I'd been based, to one of our overseas offices, and based on Chris's wishes, continued to serve on his executive leadership team. So that's the short story. Several lessons from that. And by the way, I've also had the great benefit of getting advice from a number of mentors and other founders and social entrepreneurs, some of whom are on this call, and I've also been in conversations with some of them about as they prepared to do something similar. 7 quick lessons if I have time. One is plan, if you're a leader, plan for successor transition from day one of the job. Think in specifics of the person you want your successor to be. Develop those people within your organization if possible. Set a goal of timing. You may not hit it, but think in specifics about that day when you're going to step out. When would be the best time? How long do you want to serve? What do you want to do after your transition? Second, for CEOs and particularly founders, find people inside and outside the organization who are capable and willing to give you informed and difficult feedback. And talk to those people about succession. Again, from the beginning, those people are a gift. When you can find people who are willing and able to give you informed, difficult feedback, those are the people you really want to nurture those relationships and get that feedback. We all know founders who have stayed on too long. You want to avoid that. Third, in my humble opinion, the best path for leadership succession is typically an inside path. And Bridgespan research in the article that Francois mentioned bears this out. Developing leaders inside the organization who can and cultivating them is really important. And I learned that lesson in part because I didn't do as good a job as I could have done at Landesa, frankly. Fourth, the outgoing leader has to provide substantial space for the new leaders to lead. Get out of their way. I mean, it's not to say you can't play a continuing role, but be very conscious about not getting out of their way. You have to let go. For many of us, this is the most challenging part of leadership succession. Don't get in between your successor and the other leaders in the organization. Don't get in between your successor and the board that they report to. Fifth, for boards, and this is important, boards, it's really important to shore up weaknesses in board oversight. In my experience as a donor too, as I look at boards of organizations. And the Bridgespan research again seems to support this. Board oversight of CEOs is often weak in the social sector, and I think it's particularly true of organizations that have founders as CEOs. So it's a duty of both the founder and the board to establish that greater accountability and oversight it, because without it, the risks of a bad transition increase. 6, if the founder is to have an ongoing role, and by the way, a founder having an ongoing role tends to be the best route forward. Again, the Bridgespan research points this out. But if that founder is to continue to have an ongoing role, the personal relationship between, in my experience, between the founder and the successor is critical. Invest in that relationship, create strong trust, strong communication channels in that relationship. And those communication channels, again, have to be frank, frequent, and clear.
Tim, could you finish off in about a minute? Would you like to take about 1 more minute and finish off?
Sure. I'll finish with just 2 more points. Handing off the relationship to external stakeholders in particular, but also internal stakeholders is critical. So outgoing leaders should systematically and very intentionally hand off key relationships, particularly with funders, but also with board members, with partners. Hand those off to their successor. Do that, in my experience, doing it together with the successor and being very clear about that is important. And then last, communications plan. The organization should have a very good, intentional, proactive communication plan when these transitions are happening. Get out in front of the story. If you're not very clear about the story ahead of time, people will fill in their own story in the absence of other information. And that story will not be the story you want to tell. So work with your communications team, maybe outside communications counsel, in doing a very robust communications plan around the transition. I'll stop there, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim, so much. That was very helpful. What a fascinating set of 3 talks we've had today, and very much appreciate your reflections there at the end, and the lessons, according to Tim, which you have given us. That's great. I've seen Dorothy Stoneman on the questions, Andrea. Have you seen other people as well?
Yes, I have. I'm slightly confused because so many people are entitled Caitlin. So if you have a question, please could you just raise your hand so that we've only got another 12 or 15, 14 minutes. So raise your hand so that Chris can get you to ask your question, please.
Yeah, that's great. Dorothy, why don't you start? Dorothy, can you hear me all right?
I can.
Great. Why don't you just outline your question as briefly as you might, please?
Okay, just as I said it in the chat, one of the speakers said that a new culture comes with a new CEO. And so my question was, are there circumstances in which the actual success of the organization is related to the culture established over time and the values imprinted and embedded in that culture? And so are there situations where the consultants will advise the new CEO to preserve the culture and to figure out what actually is behind it? And this question is based on a little bit of a observation, perhaps incorrect, that it seems as if new CEOs are often getting the advice that they should have their own people, their own culture, their own everything, without figuring out how to leverage the strengths of the past.
Got it. I understand. Francois, did you want to have a quick go at that one?
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure the others will want to jump in as well. It's a really good question. I mean, actually, I can only speak from personal experience that And I think some of the research shows that, that actual transition time can actually be quite risky, right? And in my own personal circumstance, the culture is actually the thing that got the organization through a kind of a really difficult 18-month period of an interim transition of directors and leadership, etc. And I think that is the culture of the organization is so strong and embedded in the way it's been set up. It actually, does the CEO adapt to the culture? Does the CEO create a new culture, or is there some combination of that that emerges? So I don't have any evidence to talk about it, but I do think we've all worked in organizations. We've all seen how what important role leaders play, but also particularly in organizations where staff are empowered and are empowered in creating the culture themselves. I know certainly in the process that I had run, I actually, together with the board, invited a whole team of staff in to help shape, what should the job description be of the new successor of the new director. And so many of the characteristics they brought in were around culture, around the kind of leader they wanted. So they almost got to shape and choose the characteristics beyond the skill sets. And so that was really interesting in terms of the process.
Thank you, Francois, for that. I'm going to invite another question because I would like to have a few more people from the participants. So Aletta Margolis, you had a question, I think.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, my question is, I'd love to hear from our speakers about what you've learned about best practice in codification. In other words, how do founders and their colleagues ensure that the unique and essential nature of their work is effectively captured and communicated to those who carry the work forward? So it's connected to culture, but more the work itself. So many of us, I think, are creating as we are doing the work. And then when it's time to pass it on, you want to be very clear on the what you're passing on. And I'd love to hear anything you've encountered in terms of best practice for doing that.
Yeah, Tim, did you want to come in on that one? Or Adriana, did you have a remark you'd like to make? Which of you would like to come in? Because both of you are coming at this cultural issue from different perspectives. But Adriana, come in first and then we'll see.
I can attempt to start here. I think in our case, and looking our own leadership transition at the Oak Foundation, so what happened was when we went through this, we had, obviously, we are an organization who have very clear processes, structured handbooks, manuals, so everything in terms of systems was already there and staff were well versed into using those. So it was really making sure that in a continuous basis that we are prepared ourselves as a staff to continue that. And then I think it's very much connected to the question before, where you have basically the board who is, I think, even more powerful than the leadership in preserving the culture and making sure that these messages and whatever needs to be transmitted from one leader to the other is done well, and they ensure it by obviously how they hired the next leader, and in trying to preserve or change a little bit that particular culture. I don't have so much experience with codification and communication, so maybe Tim, you have a little bit more practical experience from you having had to transition yourself.
Thank you, Adriana. Tim.
Well, my wife and I bought a house one time, and the buyers created a long note for us. Actually, it was almost like a book of all the things about the house they thought the next owner might not know and could know or should know in order. And that was the most useful thing. Actually, that got me thinking about doing something similar for my successor. And I never fully did it, but I took notes and kept like a working paper of things that I would want my successor to know for years, and had a long list that I then passed along to Chris. On the culture point, you know, one of the things I heard maybe between the lines on Dorothy's good question is, I think sometimes incoming leaders feel the need just to change, to put their own stamp on something, and they can that can be problematic for change for the sake of change.
Yeah.
I think on a more appropriate level, and I must say that Chris, and hats off to Chris, my successor, because he did not do this. One of the things that I saw that he did was he went in to the organization, he listened to people throughout the organization in terms of culture, figured out what was working well and what were those areas that maybe weren't working well, and then tried to build on what was working well and address the things that maybe weren't working as well. So that's I think the right way to approach it.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm bathing in this reflection of all these great Chris's that you know. We've got Catherine here, and then we'll have Deepa, and then we have other people coming in. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. So Catherine, you next. Welcome. Catherine, are you on mute maybe?
Catherine as in me? Or is there another Catherine?
Hi, Mama Cat, lovely to see you. It was actually Catherine Milligan.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, lovely
Hi,
to see
sorry,
you.
it's so lovely to be here with all of you. I'm so thrilled. I don't have a hand up though, so I don't want to skip the queue. Sorry, Chris.
No problem. That's no problem at all. We have Deepa.
We can cede the time to Deepa, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for that concession. Very, very noble of you. Deepa.
Thank you so much. I was quite interested in, Tim, you said that a founder leader should be thinking about succession from the outset. And that struck me as being really interesting. I'm the trustee of a very young organization. And from a governance perspective, do we have a duty of care and responsibility to help them think through that process now? But then, is it based on time, or is it based on what is being achieved? Because if it's the latter, then that's a slippery slope, because they'll never be content, because there's always more work to do. And so how do we as trustees support them in that process to think? I've already tried to get them to think about 100 years down the line because of something Jacob said last week. So I'm interested to see how we get them to think about not being there when it's just also new to them.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I think that was directed at you, Tim.
It was only because Tim said that should be the plan, but I'm sure Francois and Adriana might have thoughts too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thanks for the question, Deepa. It's a good one. In my humble opinion, the planning for it is less about the specific timing of it, is just recognizing that it will happen, and think about at what point generally, what maybe are the trigger points or where you want to think about handing off the transition, because you don't want to get to the point where the organization is faltering, or when you're too old and everyone's saying you need to go. So just recognizing that, one. I think the other point is about cultivating leadership and thinking about who your successor might be, or what kind of leadership you can cultivate within the organization to create candidates for successors, and thinking about that. And also, to the earlier question, thinking about creating a manual or instruction guide for your successor from the start, and keeping those notes. So I think all of the, and finding those people who can give you the feedback to tell you, you may be thinking it may be best for you to go on. One thing about this that I found very helpful for me as a leader when I started, a person told me the right leader for an organization in a given stage is not necessarily the right leader for its next stage. And so that's really important, is to think about seasons of an organization life cycle. And it may be, you may be, or X person might be the best person for that particular stage to take it to another stage. And then it may be time for another leader. And thinking about it, does that apply to me? And if so, how? And then how can you plan accordingly?
Thanks for that, Tim.
Can I just jump in with one sentence, Chris, here?
Yep.
I think it's important to think of exit from the beginning, because it also gives that very sharp focus of the work you are doing during those years. So I can see this in the foundation. We have a director who came in the Prevent Child Sexual Abuse program, and she from the beginning said, I want to have this achieved by the end, and I want to be able to live in 5 years. So she is so sharp because of that in what she wants to do, and she is extremely driven to do that, and it gives a real edge to the work that she's doing, right? Which you don't really see when you go there, and you might go and you might not, you know what I mean? So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry, Chris, if I could just jump in with just one more example. And this is an example from my wife, who leads a refugee resettlement organization. And it's a different type of example. So when she took the role, as she's an immigrant from India to the United States, of a refugee resettlement agency, she made it very clear to the board that says, I'll take this role for 5 years. Within 5 years, I'm going to step out, and I want the next leader to be a refugee for this organization. So she was very clear on her timeline from the beginning, and that worked for her. Well, it's working for her. She's coming in on that 5-year anniversary and has a refugee in place as a successor for her. So I've seen a specific organization where a specific timeline and being very specific about the type of leader you want to hand it off to seems to be working.
That's great. When I left one of my organizations, the trustees, the board of trustees, gave me a bicycle and said, okay, there you go. I'm going to turn to Jacob Matthew, and then we'll ask Mel, our co-founder colleague, to finish the session off for us. Jacob, over to you.
I think my question was really that founders very often have the privilege and the ability to play 3 roles, that of creator, deciding what needs to be preserved and what needs to be destroyed. And this cycle is so important, especially when you come into a succession space where very often the tendency is to preserve or outright destroy. So my question was really, how do you make this culture sort of stay in an organization after the founder is left?
Ah, very interesting. Francois, did you have any views on that?
I just love the way Jacob put it, and I don't think we as speakers necessarily have any more wisdom than the people in the room. So I'm happy to let Jacob, give us and share those insights with us.
No problem.
I do want to emphasize as an additional point that we focused quite a lot on the challenges here. There's actually so many beautiful moments in the succession, and I do want to kind of just make sure that we also celebrate and see that as such an interesting opportunity. And that was really a surprise for me. But also in seeing actually so many, of all of you and others in this community succeed, go through those successions and do really interesting things in the next phase. And I think that's really, really healthy. So having these discussions is amazing.
Absolutely. Great point to make. Absolutely great point to make. So I think, Adriana, did you want to come in briefly before we move over to Mel? Okay, that's fine.
I was just applauding Francois.
Perfect, absolutely. I confused an applause for a sign. Yeah, that's right. So look, thank you so much indeed. Let me ask Mel to wrap up for us.
Hey, thank you, Chris. I'm obsessed with this job of having 2 minutes to summarize all this rich content. Thank you to our 3 speakers, because your contributions were absolutely superb in a very, very short space of time, very open and candid, and rich in content, and something that we will treasure, actually. Just quickly through the speakers, and Francois was talking about his own situation in terms of a succession, where the Schwab Foundation is, and it was interesting that they were thinking about this kind of 20 years ago, and thinking about the possibility of a kind of a group that might emerge, but then changing it, now thinking about very interesting point that Francois made about how people who are maybe leaving organizations or moving on or could move into the space around where systemic changes. So a fantastic insight there, I think. I think one of the challenges for a lot of us is that, not all of us, but for a lot of us, is this is all relatively new for us. And some of us had real difficulties. So having this kind of, these thought processes about where leaders might actually go to post setting up and running their organization, I think is a really interesting thought. And Francois has also talked about ceding power and what that means and the difficulties and challenges for the individual, but for the organization, but how essential that is for the organization to succeed going forward. So that was a great start. Then we had Adriana who was talking about where the Oak Foundation was, the great work that it does in terms of particularly around human rights and some very difficult and but essential areas that are happening in the world. And I thought it was very, very interesting then, once again, really candid, talking about some of the challenges that the Oak Foundation had then around leadership. It was okay giving the funding, but then how do you build capacity? And some of that have been very, very well done, but in Ethiopia, not so well done possibly. And how to build that up again, build trust, build leadership. So it's one of the challenges. So from the other side of the coin, not just the social entrepreneurs who are having challenges around succession, but also from the funder side and their perspective was great to get as well. And then Tim coming along with his experience. And I think what Tim was actually able to demonstrate was kind of almost an exemplar of what were the right things to do. Some of us on the call would know Roy Posterman, his co-founder, really well. And I can imagine that the handover that went from Roy to Tim, and then Tim, I don't know Chris, but to his founder, that whole story and those insights that Tim gave about why it worked. I'm not going to read I have about 4 or 5 pages of notes here, by the way, the 7 pearls of wisdom that he gave, but they're absolutely right. And we should be learning from those pearls of wisdom. I'm not going to read through them about the role of boards and the relationship between the founder and the new CEO, etc. going forward. These are fantastic pearls of wisdom. But as we all know, we all haven't necessarily been in that position, and things have not gone right, and things have been very, very difficult. And so it's a question then, and it was a good question coming up about codification, and we've had that on our sessions before. How are we taking these great pearls of wisdom, these great insights that we've had today, and these good questions, and actually putting them together into some form of manual, into some form of discussion that we can all share and move forward and learn from. And in that way, we'll build the systems together. And a lot of us at the moment talking about system change. So hopefully I've done, well, I haven't done actually the session justice in that summing up, because it's not really possible to do it in 2 minutes because there's so much in there. The session's been recorded. And for those of you who want to, please listen in. I'd like to thank the speakers again. It's been fantastic. Thank you all for joining. An hour is not long enough probably to do all of this subject justice. We've agreed our topics for next year. We have 6 webinars next year, and they'll be going up on our website directly. And we'd love to see you here again. And please keep in touch. And part of our job as the Elders Council will be to collect all this rich wisdom, put it all together, and then share it with everybody so that we can all learn and hopefully move forward together on this. Thank you all again very much. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you once again.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Wonderful to see you.